IMO. It is January 2024 and I'm knee deep in my 2023 wrap up and my looking forward to 2024 videos. And one of the videos that I like to do every year is a tag, and that is the Postscript Tag. I've done this tag for the last 2 years, I believe, and I think it's a great tag that asks some questions that you might not get asked in your year-end wrap-up stuff, or you might not think of talking about in your year-end wrap-up stuff. So I think it's a really good one to do at the beginning of the following year. I can't remember who created this tag, but I will leave them listed down below, and I will also tag some people at the end, and I will leave all those people listed down below as well as my videos from previous years. Okay, before we get into the tag, I want to talk about my stats for Q4 of 2023, because I said in my goals video that I was going to do the Q4 stats here and then my year-round stats when I do my looking back at Goodreads and Storygraph video. I also want to apologize that the rest of this video is blurry. Hopefully this part isn't blurry, but oh well. So for Q4, some of the stats that I calculated on my own. So in the Storygraph video, you will see the Storygraph stats, you will see some Goodreads stats, and then you will also see like my full year stats of the stats that I pay attention to myself. So these are those stats, the stats that I compiled myself throughout each quarter in 2023. I do have them printed out, but they printed out very small. So I'm going to look at my computer here, and in Q4, I read 42 books. So this is right in line with all the quarters. For Q1, I read 36. For Q2, I read 47. For Q3, I read 44. And for Q4, I read 42. Out of those 42 books, 27 of the books that I read were new to me authors, which leaves 15 authors that I've read from before. That is 64.3% new to me authors. So I've been reading a lot of new to me authors this year, and I think that's probably going to continue into my 2024 reading, just because I have a lot of books by people I haven't read from before. I was able in Q4 of 2023 to read some rereads, which is fun, and hopefully that will also continue. So there will be some books from authors that I've read from before. Another stat that I like to look at is my nonfiction versus fiction. I read 9 nonfiction books in Q4 and 33 fiction books, so that works out to be 21.4% nonfiction. Now, it'll be interesting to see how many I read throughout the entire year, and it'll be interesting to see what that percentage sits at. I never pick a percentage goal for my nonfiction reading, just because I read nonfiction when I want to read nonfiction, and I like to read nonfiction, and I don't feel I don't read enough, or that I should read more, or if I'm feeling like, oh, I want to read more nonfiction, I just do read it throughout the year. Another stat that's going to be important next year is my translated works. So I only read 4 translated works in the last quarter and 38 non-translated works. Translated works are any books that have been translated from another language into English. So that's only 9.5% translated works in Q4. And one of my goals for 2024 is to read at least 20% translated works for my overall reading, so that might be something to look at. Another interesting stat is male, female, non-binary, or trans authors. To my knowledge, in Q4, I read no trans or non-binary authors. Now, I don't go out of my way to necessarily find this out, so it is possible that I did read some trans or non-binary authors, but in my calculation, I read 18 male authors and 24 female authors, or I should say 18 authors who were men and 24 authors who were women. That is 57.1% women authors. That seems to be about normal. It's always funny for me to think about that I didn't used to like women authors, and now I read far more women authors. Some of the stats that I like to track are my BIPOC or Asian, person of color authors versus white authors. I'm always aiming for at least 50% BIPOC or person of color authors, or I should change that mindset to be less than 50% white authors. In Q4, I read 47.6% BIPOC authors. So not quite 50%, but pretty close. That means that I read 52.4% white authors. That's 22 white authors and 20 non-white authors. Out of those non-white authors, I read 9 books by Black authors, 3 books by Asian authors, 5 books by Latinx authors, and 3 books by Indigenous authors. That's interesting. 3 books? That might be wrong. I might have read less. That is interesting because I think I have not been reading a lot of Latine or Latinx authors this year. Good to know. Good to know. Going right along with that is I like to read books by authors from different countries, different places around the world. I did read 28 books from America or by American authors this quarter, and that is 68.3%. But I also read from England, which usually is my next highest. Usually it is America, then England. Sometimes those two kind of switch around. I read 2 books by Argentinian authors. I read 1 book by a Canadian author, 1 book by a Welsh author, 1 book by an Irish author, 1 book by a Japanese author, 2 books from Mexican authors or Mexican American authors, 1 book from a New Zealand author, 1 book from a Chinese author, 1 book from a Portuguese author, 1 book from a Scottish author, 1 book from a French author, and 1 book from a Kenyan American author. So a lot of diversity there. So I'm really happy about that. That always makes me feel good. I want to be reading stories from different cultures and different countries than my own whenever possible. Obviously 28 American authors is like not ideal, but that's okay. You know, it happens. And then I read only 7 books by queer authors or with queer stories. So when I count my queer stats, I count stories that have just queer representation in general, because I think that just generally queer representation is important, even if it's by straight, cis, non-queer authors, but usually they are queer authors or queer leading authors or queer stories. But that's not a very good percentage. It's only 16.7%. That means I read 35 non-queer books, and that is 83.3%. My goal for 2023 was to read 30% queer stories, and I definitely did not achieve that this year. So I dropped it down to 25 again in 2024. Hopefully I can achieve that. And then the second to last stat that I wanted to look at was just the array of books that I read. I read 9 contemporary, 9 nonfiction, 6 horror, 8 mystery, 1 book of short stories, 2 modern classics, 4 sci-fi, 5 poetry, and 3 classics. That definitely takes into account books containing 2 different categories. So maybe I read a modern classic that was also a work of poetry, or that was, maybe I read a contemporary that also was a book of short stories. I just categorize what they mostly are in my particular stats. So if they're like half and half contemporary and mystery, or if they're like half and half horror and classic, etc. And then the final stat that I like to look at is how many of the books that I read this quarter were owned pre-2023, and obviously in the new year it'll change into pre-2024. How many were owned in 2023, so how many I acquired in 2023 and read this quarter. How many were unowned on audio. So something that I always try to do is read my own books on audio. If I'm reading audio, I try to only read books that are not owned on audio after I've read a book that is owned on audio, if that makes sense. So I'm always trying to get down my physical TBR, so I'm trying to read books that I already own that are on audio before I read books that I don't own. And then I have an other category in this pie as well, and that is for books that are borrowed from the library, books that were lent to me, books that I don't own and are not unowned on audio. So for owned pre-2023, I read 12 books. The vast majority, well, not the vast majority, but the majority of books that I read in this quarter were owned 2023 books, and that was 19 books. I also read 8 unowned audiobooks, and I read 3 other books. And I think that was one that was borrowed from my friend Kai, one that I read from the library, and I want to say one I read online or something. I don't know why there's 3, but that is interesting. I would like to be bringing in less books every month and every year, so I would like to be reading mostly books off of my that year TBR to get that big number of TBR down. And then secondly, owned and acquired in that year. And then audiobooks, and then other, or then other and audiobooks, doesn't really matter. If I'm borrowing from them from the library, which I probably will be doing more this year, that's great too. So those are my stats for quarter 4. Like I said, I will be doing my full year stats of this variety when we look at my Goodreads and my Storygraph stats. So now on to the Postscript Tag for 2023. Question number 1. What is the longest book that you read, and what book took you the longest to read in 2023? So I think the longest book that I read in 2023 was P. James' A Taste for Death. This is one of the Adam Dalgliesh books, and I've only got long Adam Dalgliesh books left to read. I've read all the short ones because I'm reading this series out of order, and now I only have really long ones left to read, which is a little bit of short-sightedness on my part and not really future-proofing myself because now I'm reading them at a slower pace. This edition of this book is actually 512 pages, which if you watched my goals video, you know I cheated a little and I said that I didn't read any books over 500 pages, but technically this one is over 500 pages, but I have other copies of this book that are less than 500 pages, so I counted those other copies instead of this particular copy. But I did end up actually reading this mass market paperback, which was 512 pages. So this was by far the longest book that I read in 2023. The book that it took me the longest to read might be Wisteria Cottage by Robert N. Copes, which I actually started in 2022 and then picked up again in 2023. And I still haven't actually finished because I ended up DNFing this one about 50% of the way through. Similarly, a book that took me a long time to read is Ace by Angela Chen, but not because I didn't like it. I actually really enjoyed this nonfiction about asexuality. But I started reading this one in April of 2023. I picked it up in June of 2023. I picked it up in October of 2023. And then I finished it on December 30th, 2023. So I technically have been reading this one for 8 months. So it took me a long time to read, but I really enjoyed this one. Super glad that I finally got to it during the year. Question number 3 is how many rereads did you do in 2023? So I didn't reread as much as I would have liked. The first reread I did was Invisible Monsters by Chuck Palahniuk. Then I reread A Night Without Armor by Jewel, which is a poetry collection. And those were during the year. In December, I participated in Remember December, which is a time to reread and a readathon all about rereading books. And I reread Claire DeWitt and the City of the Dead, which was a book that I read way back in 2012. I also reread Passing by Nella Larson and The Crying of Lot 49 by Thomas Pynchon. The next question, well actually I don't know if it's the next question, but another question is your favorite reread of the year, and that is definitely going to go to Claire DeWitt and the City of the Dead. Like I said, I read this way back in 2012 when I was working in a cafe at the Brooklyn Public Library, and I was just picking random books up. I found this one and its sequel, and I fell in love with them. I read 3 of Sarah Grant's books in quick succession, and then I didn't read another Sarah Grant book until 2022. So I was super happy to find this one at a used book sale in 2023 and be able to reread it, and I really did enjoy it, and it cemented itself as one of my favorite mysteries, probably of all time. This book follows Claire DeWitt, who is the greatest detective in the world, and she is just getting back into private investigation after she had to take a mental health break, and she ends up having to take a case in New Orleans where her mentor was killed, and it kind of ties up some loose ends in Claire's life. And the next question is a book that you read in 2023 for the first time, but are hoping to reread in the future. And I would say so many of the books that I read, I would love to reread A Rage in Harlem. I would love to reread Moon of the Crusted Snow. I would like to reread Catherine House. I would like to reread Minotaur. There's so many books that I would like to reread. One of those books that I would like to reread is For Thy Great Pain, Have Mercy on My Little Pain by Victoria Mackenzie. I thought this one was really interesting. The next question is your favorite short story or novella. I love novellas. I love short stories. I've been trying to read more short stories in 2023, and it is an unofficial goal to read more short stories in 2024. But I'm going to say The Stepford Wives by by Ira Levin for this one. I read that kind of in the middle of the year, and it was just such a amazing, compelling, timely novella, horror novella. I really enjoyed that one. I thought it was great. If you have not read it and you like horror, I would definitely suggest reading The Stepford Wives. I knew I skipped one. The question that I skipped was a book that you read that got you out of your comfort zone. And I think that although I read a lot of varied work, there was nothing that was super far out of my comfort zone. I could say For Thy Great Pain Have Mercy on My Little Pain by Victoria Mackenzie, because this is a historical fiction set in like the 1400s, which is very rare for me to read anything like that. And it is all about religion and religious women and their religious visions that they had. So I would say that that's out of my comfort zone, but I really love this short novella that's told in like vignettes. I would highly recommend this one. Okay, getting back to the order of questions, the next question is mass appeal. Recommend a book for everyone. And I would say The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. I read this way back in February of 2023, but I really enjoyed it, and I didn't think I was going to. I thought it was too literary, it was too women's fiction, and I wasn't going to like it, but actually I think there's something for everyone. I love this story about two sisters who can both pass for white, but who choose very different lives. For that reason, it's often compared to Passing. This book is not like Passing. Although that premise is similar, there's so much more about each woman and the other people in their lives in this book. So it definitely is more of like a family saga. It's definitely more of an intergenerational saga. And it is much more of like a women's fiction. But I really enjoyed it, and I would suggest it to just about any reader. The other book that I would suggest to just about any reader is Love Poems by Nikki Giovanni. I read this at the very end of the year, and I think this is a great collection to get into Nick Giovanni's work and also just to get into poetry in general. And I definitely suggest more people reading poetry, even if it's just to break up their other reading. I really love Nick Giovanni's work, and this book, which is the second of hers that I've read, cemented that. And then the final book that I'm going to suggest is Night Tiger by Yangzi Chu. This is a Malaysian historical fiction with fantasy and magical realism elements, and it has really sweet and compelling characters. It has thrilling moments, and I think that this is a great book for people who read literary fiction but want to get into fantasy, for people who read fantasy but want to get into literary fiction, and it just has a rich descriptive nature that I think people could really enjoy. The next question is specialized appeal, a book that you wouldn't recommend to just anyone, and the first book I'm going to suggest is The Afternoon Interviews with Marcel Duchamp. This is a book of 3 interviews, all with the artist Duchamp, all during the 60s and 70s, I believe, and it's just a really insightful and interesting set of interviews about an artist's life. I think that this is specialized because not everyone is going to want to read about that, but I think it's general mass appeal because the advice and the information that he gives and the way that he lives his life is so interesting and could teach everyone about life and art. And next, I'm going to say The Removed by Brandon Hobson. I really loved this work of Native American contemporary fiction, but it does have some aspects that people would call magical realism, but I think is actually Native American spirituality. And I think that it might bother some people the way that this book is broken up and the magical aspects of this book. Again, saying magical as actual spirituality, not as a fantastical thing. But I really enjoyed this book, and I think that in the right hands, people will love it. And then finally, my specialized appeal recommendation is The Door by Magda Szabo. This is a Hungarian work by a very famous Hungarian author. And this was the most frustrating book that I read in 2023. It's got animal violence, it's got abuse, it's got codependent relationships, and it was super frustrating to read, but I think it's just an excellent book and well written, and to evoke those kind of emotions, it really has to be something special. So I don't think this book is for everyone, but it is definitely a recommendation from me. The last question is to reflect on your year in BookTube, reflect on 2023, your year of reading, and anything else that you might want to talk about at this point. So I've talked a lot about how 2023 was a really hard year for me on BookTube and that I struggled a lot. And I don't really want to reflect on that too much more. If you want to see more about that, you can go to various of my videos, including my goals video, which I will leave listed down below. But I think overall for my year of reading, I had a really great year. I think that I read too much in 2023 and I would like to read less in 2024, but I read so widely in 2023 and I think that that was really the best thing that came out of my reading, just that I read from cultures that I'd never read from before, from authors that I'd never read from before, from languages that I've never read from before, and I had such a great time just reaching out and finding all these different books. And even though I think I read too much, I wouldn't change my reading in 2023, and I can only change my reading going forward. I think overall 2023 was a hard year in some ways and a stagnant year in some ways and a year of unsureness in a lot of ways, but overall, I really had a great reading year, and I did have a great year on BookTube. Even though I struggled and I was frustrated, I made videos that I was proud of, and I connected with community that I'm proud of and happy to be part of. My overall reflection is positive, even though some things in 2023 were difficult and I struggled with. Finally, it says to tag some people. So I would love to see a lot of people do this tag because I think it's a great, like I said, year end, beginning of the new year tag, and I think it's a great way to reflect on things that you might not have already reflected on in some of your other content. So I'm going to tag Roy Reads Anything. Roy reads a ton and a ton of varied things, and I would love to hear his answers to some of these questions. I'm going to tag Jess the Book Freak. I'm going to tag The Untrained Librarian. I'm going to tag Jennifer Loves Books. She's a big rereader, so I would love to hear some of her rereading answers. I'm going to tag Nyx Reads, partly because I think she wanted to reread more and I'm not sure if she did. And I'm going to tag Gabby Likes to Read, which is a new channel to me, but I'm really enjoying her content. So no pressure to answer these if I tagged you, but if I have not tagged you and you want to be tagged, consider yourself tagged in the Postscript tag. And if you want to answer the questions in the comments below, if you don't have a channel, or if you do have a channel but you don't want to make a whole video about it, please feel free to do so. Thanks so much for joining me today, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!